After the big chaos of World War I, a lot of violence and tension erupted in the United States. But why did things get so bad during the Red Summer of 1919? When the conflict ceased in other countries, a new form of challenge began in the U.S. African American soldiers who returned home after serving in the war were mistreated because of their skin color. This made things even worse, leading to a lot of unfortunate events that affected the whole country. This story delves into where it all started, what happened during that time, and what it meant for America. Through examining the causes, events, and implications of the Red Summer, we aim to shed light on this dark chapter of American history and its enduring impact on race relations in the nation. In doing so, we hope to deepen our understanding of the complexities of racial injustice and inspire efforts toward a more equitable and inclusive society for all. By learning from the lessons of the past, we can work towards a better future where all individuals are treated with dignity and respect. 1. The Great Migration and Changing Demographics, 1914 to 1919. The years leading up to the Red Summer of 1919 were characterized by significant demographic shifts and social upheaval as African Americans sought refuge from the harsh realities of Jim Crow segregation in the South. The Great Migration, a mass movement of Black populations from rural areas to urban centers in the North and Midwest, represented both a quest for economic opportunity and a flight from racial oppression. The roots of the Great Migration can be traced back to the late 19th century, but it gained momentum during World War I as industrial demand for labor increased and restrictive immigration policies limited the influx of European immigrants. Between 1914 and 1919, an estimated 500,000 African Americans migrated northward, fundamentally altering the demographic landscapes of cities such as Chicago, Detroit, and New York. The push factors driving the Great Migration were manifold. In the South, African Americans faced systemic racism and economic exploitation under the Jim Crow regime. Discriminatory laws and practices denied them basic civil rights, relegated them to inferior schools and housing, and subjected them to violence and intimidation by white supremacists. Lynchings and other forms of racial terror were commonplace, instilling fear and insecurity in Black communities. Meanwhile, the North promised the prospect of greater economic opportunity and social mobility. The booming industrial economy offered jobs in factories, steel mills, and meatpacking plants, drawing African Americans seeking escape from the cycle of sharecropping and agricultural poverty. Additionally, the North was perceived as a relatively more tolerant and progressive region, where racial discrimination was not as overt or legally sanctioned. The outbreak of World War I further accelerated the pace of migration as wartime production created a high demand for labor. Northern industries recruited Black workers to fill vacancies left by white men who had enlisted in the military. The promise of steady employment and higher wages lured thousands of African Americans to cities like Chicago, where they found work in the burgeoning meatpacking industry and other manufacturing sectors. The migration experience was often fraught with challenges and hardships. African Americans faced discrimination and hostility in their new urban environments, where they encountered resistance from white workers and residents who viewed them as competitors for jobs and housing. Racial tension simmered beneath the surface as Black migrants clashed with white ethnic groups, many of whom were themselves recent immigrants grappling with their own economic insecurities. Despite these obstacles, the Great Migration marked a profound turning point in African American history. It represented a collective assertion of agency and resilience as Black populations sought to carve out better lives for themselves and future generations. The influx of African Americans into northern cities sparked a cultural renaissance known as the Harlem Renaissance, where Black artists, writers, and intellectuals flourished and challenged prevailing stereotypes and prejudices. By 1919, the demographic landscape of urban America had been irrevocably transformed by the Great Migration. African Americans comprised a significant and growing proportion of the population in cities across the North, contributing to the cultural vibrancy and economic dynamism of urban life. However, the migration also laid bare the deep-seated racial divisions and inequalities that continue to shape American society, setting the stage for the tumultuous events of the Red Summer. 2. The spark of violence and escalating tensions. 1919. The Red Summer of 1919 stands as a watershed moment in American history, epitomizing the racial tensions and violence that erupted across the nation in the aftermath of World War I. This period, characterized by economic competition, social upheaval, and racial animosity, witnessed a surge of unrest and bloodshed. It is a stark reminder of the racial tensions and violence that permeated American society in the aftermath of World War I. The combination of economic competition, social upheaval, and racial animosity created a volatile environment ripe for conflict, leading to a series of tragic events that unfolded across the nation. The Red Summer of 1919 saw a surge in racial violence and civil unrest as tensions between Black and white communities reached a boiling point. Incidents of lynching, mob violence, and race riots erupted in cities and towns from coast to coast, leaving a trail of death and destruction in their wake. The violence was fueled by a toxic combination of economic anxiety, social resentment, and racial prejudice, as white mobs lashed out against perceived threats to their dominance and privilege. One of the most infamous incidents of the Red Summer occurred in Washington, D.C., where a rumor of Black men assaulting a white woman sparked 4 days of rioting and bloodshed. Mobs of white civilians and off-duty soldiers descended upon Black neighborhoods, indiscriminately attacking residents and setting fires to homes and businesses. In nearby Norfolk, Virginia, a parade celebrating the return of Black troops from Europe devolved into a bloody melee, leaving 2 Black servicemen dead and many more injured. Chicago, one of the nation's largest and most racially divided cities, was also engulfed in violence during the summer of 1919. The spark for the rioting came when a Black teenager drowned after being stoned by a white mob for swimming in a whites-only area of Lake Michigan. The ensuing chaos lasted for days as mobs of white and Black residents clashed in the streets, leaving dozens dead and hundreds injured. The state militia was eventually called in to restore order, but the scars of the violence would linger for years to come. The violence was not confined to the North. Southern states also experienced their share of racial strife during the Red Summer. In Elaine, Arkansas, a dispute over labor rights led to a massacre of Black sharecroppers by white vigilantes and law enforcement officers. The violence was sparked when a white law officer was killed in a shootout outside a meeting of Black sharecroppers, leading to a brutal crackdown by state authorities. Estimates of the death toll vary, but it is believed that hundreds of Black men, women, and children were killed in the massacre. The Red Summer of 1919 laid bare the deep divisions of injustices that pervaded American society, exposing the fragility of race relations and the violence of white supremacy. It was a period of terror and trauma for Black communities across the country, as they faced the brutal reality of racial violence and discrimination. However, it was also a time of resistance and resilience, as Black Americans fought back against their oppressors and demanded justice and equality. The events of the Red Summer served as a wake-up call for the nation, prompting calls for reform and greater attention to the plight of African Americans. It galvanized the nascent civil rights movement and inspired generations of activists to continue the fight for racial justice and equality. While the scars of the Red Summer may still linger, its legacy lives on in an ongoing effort for a more just and equitable society for all. 3. Economic discontent and social unrest, 1918 to 1919. When the fighting stopped in Europe in 1918, American soldiers who were coming back home thought they would be welcomed as heroes and things would go back to normal. However, the transition from wartime mobilization to peacetime demobilization proved to be anything but smooth. The end of World War I brought about a period of economic uncertainty and social upheaval, exacerbated by the reintegration of millions of veterans into civilian life and the destabilizing effects of the Great Migration. The post-war period witnessed a wave of labor strikes and industrial unrest as workers, emboldened by wartime sacrifices and inspired by radical ideologies, demanded better wages, working conditions, and job security. The specter of Bolshevism loomed large in the minds of policymakers and business leaders who viewed labor activism as a threat to the established order. In this climate of suspicion and paranoia, African American workers found themselves doubly marginalized, facing discrimination not only from their white counterparts, but also from the broader society. Returning African American servicemen faced a particularly hostile reception as they sought to reclaim their place in civilian life. Many Black veterans returned from the war with high hopes of securing economic opportunities and social advancement, only to be met with disillusionment and frustration. The assurance of equality in citizenship, declared by Woodrow Wilson and echoed in the talk during the war, seemed empty considering the ongoing racial discrimination and violence. The economic dislocation caused by the war further exacerbated racial tensions as white workers resented the perceived competition from Black laborers. The influx of African Americans into northern cities, drawn by the promise of jobs and freedom from Jim Crow oppression, intensified competition for employment and housing, leading to resentment and hostility among white residents. Black workers, often relegated to the lowest rungs of the economic ladder, were viewed with suspicion and derision by their white counterparts, who saw them as threats to their livelihoods and social status. The situation was compounded by the prevalence of racial stereotypes and prejudices that depicted African Americans as inherently inferior and unworthy of equal treatment. Black laborers were often relegated to menial and low-paying jobs, denied access to skilled trades and professional opportunities reserved for whites. The legacy of slavery and segregation cast a long shadow over American society, perpetuating patterns of racial inequality and discrimination that persisted long after emancipation. In the aftermath of the Russian Revolution of 1917, fears of radicalism and subversion swept across America, fueling a climate of paranoia and suspicion. African American workers, already marginalized and disenfranchised, became convenient scapegoats for the anxieties and insecurities of white society. The specter of Bolshevism served as a convenient pretext for suppressing dissent and maintaining the status quo as authorities cracked down on labor activism and political dissent. Against this backdrop of economic discontent and social unrest, the stage was set for the explosive events of the Red Summer of 1919. The convergence of racial tensions, economic insecurity, and political radicalism created a volatile cocktail that would erupt in violence and bloodshed, leaving a lasting legacy of trauma and injustice in its wake. 4. African American resistance and mobilization. 1919. Amidst the chaos and violence of the Red Summer of 1919, African Americans refused to passively accept their victimization. Instead, they demonstrated remarkable resilience and courage in the face of adversity, mobilizing to defend their communities and demand justice in the aftermath of racial terror. One of the most significant responses to the violence of the Red Summer came from prominent African American leaders and intellectuals who urged Black communities to assert their rights and advocate for equality. Figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of the Crisis magazine and co-founder of the NAACP, called upon black veterans to stand up against oppression and resist the forces of white supremacy. Du Bois famously declared, "We return from fighting, we return fighting." His words resonated deeply with African American communities, inspiring a sense of solidarity and defiance in the face of racial terror. Black communities also organized self-defense efforts to protect themselves from white supremacist violence. In cities like Washington, D.C. and Chicago, African Americans armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find, from clubs and pistols to kitchen knives, to fend off attacks by white mobs. These acts of resistance were not only a means of survival, but also a powerful assertion of dignity and self-determination in the face of dehumanizing violence. The Red Summer also saw the emergence of grassroots activism and community organizing among African Americans. In response to the violence and injustice they faced, black communities across the country mobilized to demand accountability and reform. Organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League played a central role in advocating for civil rights and social justice, providing legal assistance to victims of racial violence and lobbying for anti-lynching legislation. One of the most enduring legacies of the Red Summer was the heightened political consciousness and activism it inspired among African Americans. The violence and terror of 1919 galvanized black voters to become more politically engaged and assertive in their demands for equality. In the years following the Red Summer, African Americans increasingly turned to the ballot box as a means of effecting change, voting in greater numbers and electing representatives who championed their interests at the local, state, and national levels. The Red Summer also served as a catalyst for the broader civil rights movement, laying the groundwork for the activism and the organizing that would define the struggle for racial justice in the 20th century. The violence and trauma of 1919 helped to galvanize a sense of solidarity and shared purpose among African Americans, fostering a spirit of resistance and resilience that would shape the course of American history for generations to come. While the Red Summer of 1919 inflicted untold suffering and devastation upon African American communities, it also served as a crucible of resistance and resilience. In the face of overwhelming violence and oppression, Black Americans demonstrated remarkable courage and determination, refusing to be cowed by the forces of white supremacy. Their legacy lives on in the ongoing pursuit of racial justice and equality, inspiring future generations to continue the endeavor for a more just and equitable society for all. 5. Enduring repercussions and unfinished struggles. 1920 to present. While the Red Summer of 1919 marked a turning point in American history, its legacy extends far beyond the events of that fateful summer. The racial tensions and injustices exposed during this period continue to reverberate through American society, shaping the contours of race relations and the struggle for equality in the decades that followed. In the aftermath of the Red Summer, African American communities grappled with the trauma and devastation wrought by racial violence and discrimination. The scars of 1919 linger, serving as a constant reminder of the enduring legacy of white supremacy and systemic oppression. Despite efforts to address the root causes of racial inequality, progress towards racial justice remains slow and uneven. Throughout the 20th century, African Americans continue to face systemic barriers to full citizenship and equal rights. The legacy of slavery and segregation cast a long shadow over American society, perpetuating patterns of racial discrimination and economic inequality. Despite legal victories such as Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, African Americans still faced entrenched racism and prejudice in many aspects of their lives. The struggle for civil rights and racial justice has been ongoing, marked by moments of progress and setbacks. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s led to substantial progress in combating segregation and discrimination, ultimately resulting in landmark legislation like the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, The promise of full equality and justice remained elusive for many African Americans, as systemic racism persisted in housing, education, employment, and criminal justice. In recent years, the issue of racial justice has once again come to the forefront of American consciousness. The Black Lives Matter movement, stemming from protests against police brutality and racial injustice, has energized a new generation of activists and organizers in the struggle against systemic racism. The deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other Black Americans at the hands of law enforcement have sparked widespread outrage and calls for meaningful change. The events of the Red Summer serve as a sobering reminder of the deep-seated roots of racial violence and injustice in America. They underscore the urgent need for systemic change to address the structural inequalities that continue to marginalize African Americans and other communities of color. The struggle for racial justice is far from over, but the legacy of the Red Summer reminds us of the resilience and determination of those who have fought and continue to fight for equality and justice for all. Conclusion. The Red Summer of 1919 stands as a significant moment in American history, exposing the deep-rooted racial tensions and injustices that plagued the nation in the aftermath of World War I. While the violence and trauma inflicted upon African American communities during this period were devastating, the Red Summer also served as a catalyst for change. It ignited a spirit of resistance and solidarity among Black Americans, laying the foundation for the civil rights movement that would reshape the nation in the decades to come. As we reflect on the events of 1919, let us remember the sacrifices and struggles of those who fought for equality and justice, and renew our commitment to building a more inclusive and equitable society for all. The legacy of the Red Summer reminds us of the resilience and determination of African Americans in the face of adversity. It underscores the importance of confronting the injustices of the past and working towards a future where all individuals are treated with dignity and respect. By honoring the memory of those who suffered and died during this tumultuous time, we honor their legacy and reaffirm our commitment to the principles of equality and justice for all.